People ask me a lot, how do you play this? How do you play that? And what you've got to understand is there is no set rules as how you play. The main thing that dictates the way you play is how your opponents are playing, who they are and how they're playing. If they're playing real loose, you've got to play pretty tight. If they're playing tight, then you play pretty loose. Also, a thing that you got to take into consideration is the ante and the blinds. As the ante and the blinds progress, you must start playing more aggressively, because you can't just sit back and wait and wait and wait when you're anteing all your money off. So that's the way you play. You don't have a set way you play. You take all the factors that surround you into consideration, and then you play accordingly.
So there are no real guidelines for poker. If that were the case, you could just take one of those blackjack cards, put it on the table, and there would be nothing to it. There wouldn't be all this investigation. There wouldn't be all learning from experience.
And that's what most people try to imply, that there is a way to win by just following a set rules. And there's not, because there's too many variables in poker. So you have to be able to adjust your play because of the conditions and the players and the antes and the blinds. I mean, you have to be able to do that, or you'll never be a poker player.
And being able to do that is very mystical for some players, and that's why Doyle and I put together this iAmplify course that tells you the guidelines you need to be able to know when these hands are good to play and when they're not, when to raise, when to fold. Those all depend on the people, the structure of the game, the people, the structure of the game, the people. And this is what this course is about.
Unless you always buy enough chips to cover any player at the table in a no-limit game, you're going to have to be especially aware of the size of opposing stacks. You'll frequently hear experienced no-limit players ask, "How deep are you?" That's poker speak for, what's the total money and chips you have in front of you? If you have chips invested in a pot, you should already have a pretty good idea of the answer. Otherwise, you failed to take into account approximate stack sizes before getting involved. Even if you do have the most chips at the table, you still need to know how many chips opponents have, because odds change in no limit depending on how far a player can go with a hand. For instance, if your plan is to let an opponent have a cheap card now, but expect to bet too much for him to call and complete a hand on the next round, you'd better make sure both you and your opponent have enough chips so you can scare him away with your next bet. Remember, in no limit, when it's heads up, you can never bet more than the player with the fewer chips. That may seem obvious, but you must learn to use that simple fact as a tool to gauge your betting. You also need to weigh all stacks against the size of the blinds. If an opponent only has a stack 5 times as large as the big blind, you know that player isn't going to be easy to bluff once he's in a pot. So in no-limit games, it's not just important to judge your opponent's traits and disposition. You must also know how deep they are at all times. The depth of their stacks often indicates how they'll play.
You know, way back before Doyle Brunson's first super system in 1977, there were very few people who understood the scientific aspects of the game. They were mostly winning, if they won at all, through experience, the long, hard, treacherous road to acquiring poker profit. And yet there were arguments there about whether science or intuition was the way to win at poker. Doyle, what do you think about that?
Well, I think back in the old days, Mike, the players came from poverty. You know, it was the lower class people that went into professional gambling. And so I think that those players were more intuitive because they didn't have the knowledge. I mean, nowadays you see kids that are coming out of Dartmouth, Harvard, and they're all professional poker players. Well, they've got the knowledge because they've read all of the books, they've played on the internet, And so they do have a fundamental scientific way of playing. The old players, which I consider myself to be one of them, I play the way I feel. I don't know what I'm going to do until I do it. Whereas a lot of these kids have got everything programmed out, exactly what they're going to do and how they're going to play. I don't, but I think it goes back to knowing people. I think scientific knowledge is good, but I still think you have to have a knowledge of the people that you're playing, and you have to be able to do what your gut reaction is. And I think you should follow your gut.
I think what you do, though, and I've watched you play so often, and I've had you answer questions and make estimates on odds that I then went and calculated, and you turned out to be so close to the answers, it's phenomenal. I think all of this is science, that when people have natural knacks for reading people, I hope I do, I know you do, that is done primarily through observation and remembering, as you say, recall how players actually act at the poker table, what they're likely to do next. That there's a science to that as well. They call it intuition, but isn't it science?
There is, Mike, but the way I learned the odds is I got a deck of cards and I would deal hands out.
Yeah.
Just hour after hour after hour. It took me years to find out it's 9 to 5, you won't make a flush with 2 cards to come playing hold'em.
And there was no reliable information.
No, there was none at all. And then after the computers came out and these programs, the poker probes that Mike invented, you can get all the odds simply by turning on your computer and putting the right program in. You can learn all that. And so
it's changed.
It's changed immensely.
But you still have to have what you're calling intuition to get that extra edge, and that is just the perception that you know in your heart and your gut what your opponent is doing.
I think you have to have a combination of the two. I know my son is very fundamentally sound, and I consider myself to be more intuitive. But there has to be a happy medium. You need to bring them together as much as you can. And I think when you can do that, I think then you can become a complete poker player.